Hi, this is going to be more of a discussion video, something I really haven't decided on yet. I've been thinking a lot recently about literature and science and how they can relate to each other and the psychology of literature and things like that. And I kind of got thinking about this track because I was watching a video where these two guys were talking about Dunning-Kruger effect and how low levels of knowledge give people uh, high confidence, and then the more you start to learn about something, the lower your confidence gets because you start to realize how little you know. And then by the time you become an expert, your confidence level equals your level of knowledge. And I got thinking about that in relation to literature because, when you consider a science, you, like, let's say you take theoretical physics. Generally, unless you get like one of the lowest level of intelligence people, people who think the earth is flat, not many people you walk around, ordinarily on the street think they understand or can judge like general relativity or quantum mechanics or differential geometry or manifolds or linear algebra, something like that. And that's taken as an assumption. Like if some random dude on the street started saying that stuff, everyone would think he's ridiculous just by default. And I think the sciences are pretty safe in that way. Like even things that are less math based, like psychology, you can pretty quickly tell who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't, even if you don't know much about the field. It does get more difficult, but even then. But then you get to uh, things that can pretty much be considered the opposite end of the spectrum, like literature, music, visual art, sculpture, dance, things like that, where, you know, I think it can generally be taken everyone as an expert, speaking broadly. But I was thinking to myself, is that justified? And I very quickly said, no, it's not justified that everyone is like a self-expert or something. Fair enough. Let people do what they want. Let live and let live. That sort of idea, of course. But going a little further than that, is literature a science in the way that there are experts and in some sense, it shouldn't be an assumption that you can understand everything very quickly or even at all. I don't think many people make an assumption that everyone can understand, even like something like differential geometry that is from the mid 18th or mid 19th century, mid 1800s. General relativity from the early 1900s. I'm not sure many people assume they can understand that or should be able to or something. But then you get to the arts and it's much less obvious. It's like Musil says with the racehorse of genius. Things like boxing, you can't get knocked out and then there's some ambiguity whether or not you won. If you get knocked out, you lost. And I would say mathematics is sort of like, well, it depends on what, low level mathematics is like the boxing of the intellectual field because, you just ching, 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 oh, you have an answer, input, output, that sort of idea. And there is an objective answer to this or that. Higher level mathematics isn't like that. But most people encounter low level mathematics at all, if they encounter that very often. So I think the general idea is, it's, you can't bullshit it. But, and I think in some sense philosophy is closer to that, generally considered, than it is to something like an art. Although I think it overlaps quite a lot. Because I don't think many people make the assumption that you can just walk in and start, saying stuff about philosophy and it's justified. But with literature, I think people do that. That everyone's opinion is correct. Everyone is an expert, which is the logical conclusion of everyone's opinion is valued, or everyone has their own opinion. Everyone's an expert. And I kind of got thinking about this I watched this video that, I don't know how I ended up watching it, but it's 2 years old, talking about literary snobs, specifically young ones. And it said how annoying they are. Fair enough. Yeah. There's classic snobs, so they only read classics. I only read classics, Sort of like a haughty way. And yeah, that's ridiculous. But the only thing that's more ridiculous than that is someone who never reads classics. But, I was thinking to myself, comparing it to a science, which is not, the best comparison, but I think it's valuable, is, so let's say you go back and start at the beginning, how Galileo figured out the speed of light, how he tried to figure out the speed of light, how he looked at the planets, this or that. It would be a lot of hard work. It would probably be much easier to figure out how he did it by reading a one-paragraph summary on Wikipedia, and you'd probably get the same practical understanding. But you could also get a lot from reading his own original work. But that's the sort of thing that most people can just understand if you break it down in a paragraph summary. But there are a lot of things in science that don't work that way, and I think literature is exactly the same way. I've always despised people who only read SparkNotes. Well, I haven't despised the people. I despise their action of only reading SparkNotes and laughing half embarrassedly about it. Because the parts of literature that can be broken down into SparkNotes are the irrelevant parts. And I think that's related to science. I'm kind of getting off my original point. But people who only read classics, that's bad. But it's not as bad as people who only read contemporary books, because classics have been decided on by, hundreds of people throughout time. So I've always felt that you should ignore what people don't like, but you should never ignore what people like. Because if they like something, it's usually not for a horrible reason. Now, you can easily pick horrible reasons why people like things, but if they have actually thought about it and they're moderately intelligent, you can pretty much assume they have a good reason for liking this or that. A lot of people have horrible reasons for disliking things, so I ignore most of that. But so in that way, you start at the beginning, you start reading the Greeks, the Greek authors, then you go to the Romans, and then you go to medieval Christian poetry, and then, speaking of the Western canon, you go to the Renaissance, Spanish Golden Age, English Golden Age, English Renaissance, so on. Not many people do that. But I think the general feeling is that you can be like a literary critic, or you can be like an intellectual or a teacher, and you can just have one very particular section of interest, not have a wide understanding of the general aspects of literature. I'm not sure if people in sciences can get away with that. But I think people in literature are allowed to get away with that. And I don't think that's justified. And in that way, I think the young classic snobs, the undergraduate classic snob, is on the right track. Most likely for the wrong reason, but nonetheless, they're on the right track. And then the next connection I had to this was, is literature supposed to be accessible? Because, connecting it to a science or mathematics or philosophy, who assumes that the new mathematics should be accessible? Who assumes that the thing winning the Fields Medal should be understood by some random person walking through a mall? Nobody. Nobody ever assumes that. And no one would ever take that as a fault of the mathematics. It would be absurd. You'd laugh at the person who said that. But people who make the same judgments about literature don't get laughed at. It's generally taken as a fault if everyone can't understand something in art. Generally by the general population, or at least the most common opinion is that if it's hard to understand, that means something's wrong with it. But it's almost the other way around. The assumption in the sciences is the other way around. I also got on this way of thinking by reading some of Freeman Dyson's letters that he had written. So they were about Richard Feynman. I think they may have been diaries or something, because he was writing about Feynman, not to him. But he was saying, basically, Richard Feynman was a genius. He came up with extremely good ideas, and they were so far ahead that other people had to, in some sense, simplify them and then explain them, which was what Freeman Dyson did. And that's not to say Feynman couldn't have explained them himself. He was an excellent teacher. But, it's just a simple fact. He was so far ahead of everyone that they had to catch up. And that's taken as a given in science. Like, that is an assumption that is the case. But literature does not hold the same assumptions. At least the general populace of literary professors, critics, readers, whatever you want to say. Because somehow popularity is a bonus for an artwork. Don't you want to be a part of that? It being popular. Why is that? It's very odd. It's very odd. Because you can imagine, imagine a scientist saying, don't you want to be a part of that next theory? It's like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with anything. I would rather prove the theory wrong if it was wrong than be a part of it. It's just very, very bizarre that these connections, making the same connections between two fields. Yeah, it's very bizarre. And I also think it's interesting that I've been looking into psychology a lot, and the psychology of art is in its primitive stages still, which I thought was very surprising, because the philosophy of art while it's not nowhere near like the philosophy of politics or ethics or something, it's pretty old. It's pretty well established, pretty thorough. Of course, psychology is as like a designated field much younger than philosophy. Psychology being only maybe 200 years old and being generous. So it makes sense that it's not as robust, but still I was like, wow, psychology of art is, there's almost nothing on it comparatively compared to, for example, the psychology of language, which is its own field basically. So I just found that odd. So then that got me thinking, well, is literature a science? You could take it as a science because there's professors that teach it. It just happens to be one of the oldest sciences, maybe the oldest, because there have always been people teaching books. That's one of the oldest ways of teaching. That's what the Romans did. I take it that's what the early religions did. Take a book, teach with it. So in some sense, teaching literature, is the oldest science, and maybe in that way it's bogged down by its history. And since science itself is so young, comparative to literature, it can kind of shed off any like primitivisms that would remain if it was older. But it's so young, and it can shake off all the really weird stuff that would have hung on, like I think that hangs on with religion, literature, poetry. Music is really brilliant in that way because for the longest time music was non-preservable, like especially the sound. You can, for a little while they preserved the written notation, but music is gone. It's gone. So it's constantly refreshed. So in that way, it automatically shrugs off all the old, you know, uh, the decayed parts of it. It's constantly refreshed until they started writing it down. But I don't think that really stopped music much. But in that way, I think some other things could be bogged down by their history. Yeah, I got to thinking about that a lot. Is literature science? Yeah, tell me what you think. I didn't really explore it totally in this video. That's because I didn't want to waste too much time because I've just thought of this last couple days. So yeah, please let me know what you think. I may make another video on it. Says like an expansion. So all right, hope you enjoyed. Death is Gang Boss.